Aretha Franklin had to stand and sing for 10 grueling hours inside a greasy fast food joint, her feet aching inside high heels, only to receive a paycheck unfit for a third-rate lounge singer. Meanwhile, Universal Pictures willingly burned millions to crush 60 cars right in the heart of poverty-stricken Chicago, and legends like James Brown or Ray Charles. They worked in stifling 40-degree Celsius churches, with no air conditioning and not a single word of concern. Behind the arrogant grins of the two men in black suits lay a crumbling set. The male lead, John Belushi, was silently fracturing, and every time he vanished. The greatest pioneers of American music were left waiting in the dark, bathed in disrespect. The Blues Brothers became a monumental classic. But exactly how ruthlessly did Hollywood commercialize the black soul trapped inside it? These 21 facts will ensure you never look at that poster the same way again. 1. Queen Aretha Franklin and the washed-up gamble. In 1979, the American music industry was undergoing a ruthless transition. Original soul music was being pushed into the shadows. Aretha Franklin, the woman who defined an entire generation, was suddenly viewed by the industry as a dusty relic. When Universal Pictures sent her an invitation to join the Blues Brothers, it was far from a tribute in the eyes of the investors. Her appearance was merely a risky gamble with a modest paycheck, unworthy of a backup singer, let alone the Queen of Soul. But Aretha signed the papers. Despite the cheapness of the contract, her appearance on screen became a razor-sharp reminder to the world of who truly owned the throne. The shooting day for the track Think. The set was constructed as a soul food restaurant in Chicago. The weather outside was suffocating. The atmosphere inside the soundstage was exponentially worse. The design team had created a brutally authentic set. Blazing ovens, the acrid smell of grease permeating the air, thick kitchen smoke stinging the nose. In the middle of that blazing furnace, Aretha Franklin appeared, a tight pink waitress uniform, pointed high heels. The director yelled action, once, twice, then dozens of times. The technical crew made their impatience obvious. They continuously demanded she do it again simply because of a misplaced shadow, an unsatisfactory camera angle, or lighting that wasn't sharp enough. Aretha stood there for 10 grueling hours. Her feet swollen, her bones aching to the marrow inside the cramped shoes, her makeup melting under the intense heat of the studio lights and kitchen smoke. During the fleeting breaks, there was no decent cushioned chair, no inquiries about her well-being from the production heads. The crowd of crew members rushed past her. They were busy with their cables and machinery. They treated a music legend no differently than an unknown extra waiting for their turn to read lines. When the spotlight hit her sweat-beaded face, Aretha looked up, her gaze drilled directly into the lens. There was no acting in that moment. It was sheer rage compressed into audio. Every soaring high note rang out, sharp as a knife, tearing through the thick kitchen smoke. She used the very weapon that had brought her to the pinnacle of glory to deliver a fatal blow to the industry waiting to bury her. She stood there, biting her lip to endure the physical exploitation of a prolonged shift, just to carve an undeniable truth into history. The Queen was still here. No one had the right to strip away her voice. She silently endured the heat of that dilapidated kitchen. But the real heat came from the theater doors slamming shut the moment the film premiered. 2. Ruthless loopholes and cinematic redlining. In the real estate sector, redlining was an invisible boundary stripping black people of their right to mortgage loans. In 1980s Hollywood, redlining took on a more sophisticated form. No one forbade black legends from appearing on film, but they were strictly not allowed to be the faces selling the tickets. The Blues Brothers eventually grossed $115 million, becoming a box office explosion. But to reach that number, especially in southern states and conservative regions, Universal Pictures had to play a highly calculated political game. The executives understood the ruthless rules of the market at the time. They looked at the script. They saw Aretha Franklin, saw James Brown, saw Ray Charles, and they knew for certain if they put these R&B names at the forefront as a marketing pivot. Numerous theater chains in white neighborhoods would quietly find excuses to limit screenings. Racism didn't retreat after the civil rights marches. It simply put on a capitalist suit and judged people by their profitability. The studio solution: they turned two rebellious white men into a Trojan horse. The music, the sweat, and the legacy of the black community were used as the lifeblood of the project. But the outer shell, the ticket to pass through the theater doors, had to be the faces of John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. It was a bitter compromise. In Chicago, R&B legends were draining their strength on set, singing about freedom and brotherhood. Meanwhile, in the marketing offices of Los Angeles, their aura was systematically minimized to ensure the film's safe release. The studio gambled the entire commercial lifespan of the project on a safety net named John Belushi. But they didn't foresee one thing. Handing unchecked power to a spiraling star pushed the project straight into a financial black hole, and to keep that safety net from collapsing before the cameras stopped rolling, Hollywood turned a blind eye and approved expenditures that shook the entire set. 3. The Belushi tax and Dan Aykroyd's helplessness. According to the accounts of many crew members from that year, massive evaporating sums were listed on the ledgers under an innocuous name, waiting costs. But everyone on the crew tacitly understood it was the Belushi tax. The leading man, John Belushi, kept vanishing from the set, sinking deep into a severe dependency on narcotics, dragging an entire system into a standstill. The winter of 1979 in Chicago was a nightmare. Temperatures dropped to freezing. Winds off Lake Michigan howled through the cracks of the old buildings. Hundreds of people, from lighting technicians and logistics staff to great pioneers like Ray Charles or Cab Calloway, were left rooted to the spot on those windswept streets. They waited 1 hour, 2 hours, sometimes half a day. The shooting schedule was shredded. The massive machine had to brake hard for one single reason: the leading man had disappeared again. Belushi was sinking to the bottom. He wasn't just playing a rebel on screen, he was living the life of a man with cut brakes. The abuse was quietly draining the humanity from him day by day, instead of halting the project for medical intervention to save a human being. The studio chose to throw money at the problem to cover it up. Dan Aykroyd, his co-star and closest brother, repeatedly put on his coat, quietly leaving the safe filming zone to walk through the cold Chicago nights, scouring the streets to drag his friend back. The peak of helplessness came when the production team had to bite the bullet and hire a security specialist named Smokey Wendell at an exorbitant salary. His official title on paper was bodyguard. But this man's real job wasn't to protect Belushi from fans. He was a warden, his only mission tail, Belushi, 24/7, stand guard outside his hotel room door, and use physical force if necessary to stop anyone carrying illicit substances from slipping in. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash were quietly dispersed by the studio, buying off side troubles, cleaning up the damages Belushi caused during his uncontrollable binges. It was a cold-blooded investment. Hollywood didn't throw money to protect an individual's health. They spent money to maintain his last shred of fleeting sobriety, just long enough for him to stand steady in front of the lens and spit out his dialogue. Amidst the bone-chilling cold of Chicago, the enabling nature of an industrial system was laid bare. They locked a man inside the cage of fame, pumping money into his festering wounds. But money can only control a decaying body. It can never force a soul. 4. The live-singing battle, when the machines surrendered. The backing track blared from the playback speakers. Director John Landis's request was simple lip sync to the pre-recorded track. Save time, clean audio, standard Hollywood procedure. But they forgot who they were giving orders to. Aretha Franklin didn't grow up in sterile recording studios. Her foundation was the cathedrals shaken by live vocals. The roots of soul music don't lie in the clinical precision of every musical measure, But in the explosion at the exact moment, the sound is born. Forcing her to lip-sync to a pre-packaged audio track was like cutting off an eagle's wings and demanding it to fly. The standoff erupted right on the Chicago set. Aretha stood completely still. She didn't lip-sync, she sang with her real voice. The raw, surging sound from her chest slammed against the walls, entirely crushing the digital playback track. The production team grimaced. The director called for a halt. Assistants rushed over, reminding her of the set's rules. Aretha firmly shook her head. Every attempt to force her into a fixed rhythm failed, because she never sang a song the exact same way twice. She refused to trade the freedom of music for the emotionless uniformity of an industrial system. The tug-of-war ended with the machines surrendering. The production team was forced to step back, gritting their teeth as they reconfigured the system to record her performance live. If you rewatch the movie and listen closely to the think sequence, you will notice moments where Aretha's lip movements are slightly out of sync with the audio. You can hear the hasty intakes of breath and the authentic, rough vibration in her throat. The frame is imperfect. But that technical imperfection was a glorious victory for art. Those offbeat notes are ironclad proof that machines can force the bodies of legends. But they will never strip away or control the wild heartbeat of soul music. Digital tech surrendered to Aretha, but another legend was bowing to a pile of bills. 5. James Brown and the Debt. The church sequence has always been praised as one of the most explosive, high-energy moments in 80s cinema. James Brown starring as Reverend Cleophas James. He steps up to the pulpit, spins around, throws his signature kicks, screams out space-tearing sounds, calling for salvation. The crowd goes wild. The audience sees ultimate euphoria. But what was happening just behind the camera rig was an incredibly harsh reality. In 1979, the godfather of soul wasn't basking in glory. He was standing right on the edge of bankruptcy. The IRS was cornering him with massive back taxes. His golden era was behind him. James Brown didn't have many options other than draining his life force to cling to this industry. Under the heat of thousands of watts from the high-intensity spotlights, the temperature inside the sealed church skyrocketed. Sweat poured like rain, soaking his pastoral robes. He had to continuously perform jumps and spins for hours on end. His vocal cords were strained from screaming dozens of times for the same camera angle. The staggering steps and broken breaths after every cut from the director were a naked testament to his physical exhaustion. In reality, James Brown was performing in the circumstances of a man backed into a corner. Every time he launched himself into the air, it carried the heavy weight of a grueling survival effort. Hollywood coldly captured the classic footage, packaging that energy into a commercial product. They thoroughly exploited the talent of a falling legend, paid him a fixed flat fee, and permanently locked the door to profit sharing. James Brown danced to survive, but the man sitting next to the piano chose another way to exist in this hell. He didn't dance. He didn't resist. He simply wore his glasses and turned himself into an island. 6. The irony of Ray Charles and the untouchable contract. In The Blues Brothers, Ray Charles plays the owner of Ray's Music Exchange, a blind man who is fully prepared to pull out a gun and shoot straight into the wall to stop a petty theft right in his store. General audiences laughed at the comedic detail, but the most piercing satire existed entirely outside the script. The history of the American recording industry is an indictment of systemic theft. Countless black artists from previous generations died in poverty, tricked by record labels into signing contracts that stripped them of all ownership rights to their master recordings. Their music generated millions of dollars, while they themselves only received pennies. Ray Charles was a rare and hardened exception. As early as 1962, he executed an unprecedented negotiation with ABC Paramount, securing total ownership of his own master tapes. He was one of the first black artists to smash the core exploitative mechanism of the entertainment industry. Amidst the dense screaming of the Blues Brothers set, where the studio was exploiting the extras' energy and paying guest artists cheap, fixed wages. Ray Charles appeared as an oasis of calm. He didn't need to argue. He sat peacefully by his electric piano. His signature dark sunglasses weren't a psychological shield to escape reality, as rumors suggested. It was simply the demeanor of a man who knew the rules of the game. He leisurely completed his role because he knew a cold truth: Hollywood could use his image on set. But his entire real musical legacy was safely locked away in a vault, forever out of reach of any studio executive. Ray Charles chose to protect himself with ironclad legal clauses. But one of his peers had to use his very identity to clash head-on, right in front of the camera. 7. Cab Calloway, 73 years old, and the rejection of the disco trend. When Cab Calloway was cast to reprise his classic Minnie the Moocher, the studio executives sent him a suggestion reeking of coercion. They asked him to sing to an upbeat, thumping disco arrangement to catch the tastes of the youth. They assumed an artist who had just turned 73, absent from the charts for years, would obediently bow to the rules of cash flow. They were wrong. Cab Calloway looked straight at executives who were the age of his grandchildren. His refusal was ironclad, leaving no room for negotiation. The jazz and blues of his generation were forged from the true stories of the black community, from cramped taverns to long, sleepless nights, distorting it into shallow. Empty dance music was a betrayal. Despite the apprehension from the production crew, he stepped onto the stage. The atmosphere instantly shifted. The pristine, classic white tailcoat, the masterful footwork. And when the vocal chant "He de ho" rang out in its true original style, all hundreds of extras and crew members seemingly held their breath. His unwavering stance created one of the most satisfying cinematic sequences, while simultaneously leaving Hollywood with an expensive lesson: you cannot use money to reprice core values. An act of deeply proud cultural preservation. But that artistic respect directly contrasted with how the studio treated the streets of Chicago right after. 8. 60 car wrecks and the upheaval in Chicago. Anyone who has seen the movie vividly remembers the scene where 60 police cars slam into each other. Shattered glass, mangled metal. Audiences in theaters cheered at the most expensive chase sequence in cinematic history at the time. But if you pan the camera away from the burning vehicles, you will see a stinging reality. The neighborhoods in Southside Chicago, where the crew chose to film, were sinking deep into an economic crisis. Factories were shutting down. The unemployment rate within the black community was skyrocketing. Thousands of families were struggling with every single bill to serve the million-dollar chase scenes. The film crew cordoned off numerous streets for days on end. They turned a residential area fighting to make a living into a massive, smoke-filled construction zone. Commutes were thrown into chaos. Small, local shops that were already struggling for customers were now forced to shut down completely because security barricades were strung up everywhere. The studio paid the city government to acquire the privilege of temporarily stripping away the living space of the residents. Hollywood borrowed the decay of impoverished streets as a backdrop to heighten the gritty realism of their work. Yet they brutally interfered with the daily rhythms of the very people trapped there. The hardship of a community was commandeered as a prop for an entertainment reel. And the moment the cameras stopped, the crew casually swept up the scrap metal and left. That ruthless habit of sweeping up didn't just happen on the streets. Right inside Universal's editing bays, executives were using their shears to shred something more important than the scenery, the very historical core of the script. 9. The phone book script and the dilution of history. The original script, penned by Dan Aykroyd, was a massive tome thick as 324 pages. On set, the studio crew mockingly nicknamed it the phone book. Inside those 300 pages lay more than just car chases and physical gags. Aykroyd had labored to write a genuine chronicle. In early drafts and subsequent interviews, He revealed an ambition to dedicate significant screen time to explaining the origins of the music, honoring the black artists who created them out of destitution. He wanted the film to be a sharp cultural document, using laughter to pave the way for thorny truths about American music history. But that phone book was tossed onto the desks of Hollywood editors, and the scissors went to work. A 324-page script is a nightmare for theatrical runtimes and production budgets. The studio decided to gut it. A slew of sequences digging into the history of black culture were mercilessly crossed out to make room for high-speed action. The final result was a film where mainstream audiences could comfortably laugh and bounce to the beat, without having to face any heavy truths about the roots of the music they were consuming. The origins of blues music were systematically diluted. The studio executives succeeded in creating an entirely safe entertainment product. They stripped away the historical core, keeping only the musical wrapper to ensure the film could sell tickets anywhere. They wanted everything to remain within the safe control of a comedy. But there was one thing, or more accurately, one person, who completely slipped out of their orbit, pushing a multi-million-dollar project to the brink of chaos. 10. The Uncrowned King on a Stranger's Sofa. July 1979. The entire set fell into paralysis. Hundreds of crew members stopped working. Panic spread across the security team's walkie-talkies. The leading man, John Belushi, Universal Pictures' most expensive comedy star at the time, had vanished without a trace. Dan Aykroyd split from the crew, trudging through the neighboring residential blocks. After hours of searching, he knocked on the door of a completely unfamiliar, modest house a few streets away from the set. The door opened. The sight that met Aykroyd's eyes was more harrowing than any script. The most powerful star in America, the man dominating every magazine cover, was lying curled up, passed out on the worn-out sofa of a stranger's family. No flashing camera lights, no squad of bodyguards, no constant arrogant grin. Only a crumbling body remained. As Dan Aykroyd later recounted, Belushi had wandered there in a state of total exhaustion. He brought no money or the arrogance of a superstar. He merely knocked on the door, asking for a glass of milk and a place to rest his head before passing out from sheer fatigue. That worn-out sofa was the cruelest prison of fame, and Belushi wasn't the only inmate pacing inside that cell. 11. Carrie Fisher and the Hidden War Behind the Lens. When the director yelled cut and the high-voltage lights flicked off, actress Carrie Fisher, who played the assassin constantly tailing the male lead, would routinely vanish from everyone's sight. On screen, the audience saw a cold, hilarious, and deadly Carrie Fisher. But behind the lens, she was wrestling with a true war for survival, right at the time of filming The Blues Brothers. The crushing pressure from the monumental success of Star Wars had pushed Carrie Fisher into a breakdown. In her later autobiographies like Wishful Drinking, she publicly admitted to beginning her substance use and facing bipolar disorder right during this period. But Hollywood's rules left no room for weakness. A rising female star was not permitted to show that she was falling apart. Fisher had to manage it alone. No medical team for support, no intervention from the studio. She had to put on flawless makeup, smile for the camera, and bury all her trauma in the dark corners of the set. Carrie Fisher's presence in this film is the clearest evidence of the entertainment industry's cruelty. It can drain the mind of a young actor to the point where they have to use their own acting skills just to hide their pathology. The draining of humanity occurred silently backstage. But the most blatant, stinging robbery was publicly displayed by Hollywood right in front of the whole world through soulless posters. 12. The nameless legends on the poster. The Blues Brothers soundtrack quickly went double platinum, selling millions of copies and bringing a massive stream of cash to the studio. But if you hold the original poster or the 1980 vinyl cover in your hands, try a little test. Find the names of the people who actually created the sound that formed the lifeblood of this work. You will see the images of two white actors printed boldly, dominating the entire center under the spotlight, and the black masters from Aretha, James, Ray, cab to guitar virtuoso, Matt Guitar Murphy, or drummer Willie. Too Big Hall, where are they? Their names, if they were lucky enough not to be entirely crossed out in international promotional campaigns, were pushed down into tiny print, faintly stamped in the obscure corners of the cover. That wasn't a design team error. That was a cold-blooded commercial strategy. Hollywood craved black music, but they decided to use white faces as the packaging to sell tickets. This expropriation of credit wasn't hidden in under-the-table contracts. It happened publicly, clear as day. That poster still hangs on the walls of millions of theaters and living rooms across the world today. Two men in sunglasses standing proudly in the center, and the music that got them there, along with the actual people who created it, still sits quietly in a faded corner, a place few think of when they look up. 13. The church sequence. The church sequence has always been praised as one of the most explosive, high-energy moments in 80s cinema. James Brown, starring as Reverend Cleophas James, steps up to the pulpit, spins around, throws a signature kick, screams to call for salvation. The audience sees ultimate euphoria. But what happened behind the lens was an incredibly harsh reality. In 1979, the godfather of soul wasn't basking in glory. He was standing right on the edge of bankruptcy, cornered by the IRS with massive back taxes. James Brown had no other choice but to drain his life force to cling to the industry. He wasn't playing the role of a saved man. He was screaming and dancing with all his desperation to find a way out of his own financial crisis. But James Brown wasn't the only one drained of energy under the high-intensity floodlights that day. Right below the pulpit, another act of torture was silently unfolding. To save budget, the studio rented a completely enclosed space with zero air conditioning right in the middle of a brutal Chicago heat wave. Hundreds of older women in the black choir were forced to wear thick woolen robes. The smell of sweat mixed with burning incense to create a suffocating, breathless atmosphere. According to accounts from those on set, the terrifying heat caused many elderly extras to nearly pass out, requiring on-site medical assistance. However, instead of improving working conditions, the production team only gave them a few fleeting minutes of rest before demanding they stand up and dance again. Hollywood coldly packaged James Brown's misery and the endurance of hundreds of women to turn it into an entertainment product. The faith and radiance the choir displayed on screen wasn't acting. It was the power of faith and the extraordinary patience of women who were all too used to having their labor exploited amidst the apathy of the system. They used faith to overcome exploitation, but another man on the set chose to protect himself with a more naked weapon, a contract of steel. 14. The lockdown and the public handshake with Chicago police. On screen, The Blues Brothers is a grand rebellion against the system. Two men in black suits publicly taunt the law and crush dozens of patrol cars. The audience gloats, but behind the lens. The relationship between Hollywood and the police force was a contract reeking of money. In 1979, to move their equipment deep into the black neighborhoods on the South Side. Universal Pictures didn't need any conspiratorial under-the-table agreements. They bought protection publicly. With the green light from Mayor Jane Byrne, the production crew threw money to hire a massive force of Chicago police, both on-duty officers and off-duty personnel, to establish a security perimeter. They turned a neighborhood struggling with poverty into an impenetrable fortress. The irony presents itself with deep bitterness. For the black community on the South Side at the time, the police badge was a symbol of intense surveillance and daily pressure. When Hollywood stepped in, they demanded the locals and extras sing and dance about brotherhood and liberation. Yet, all of that euphoric footage took place right under the heavy guard of the very police officers standing to protect the studio's million-dollar camera rigs. The filmmakers borrowed the cultural colors of black people for entertainment material, yet placed it under a tightly locked security net. They glorified the rebellious spirit of the streets, while simultaneously using their financial power to hire that exact oppressive system as a private security force. A film about freedom, shot inside a coldly locked down zone. And that ruthless lockdown didn't just stop at the streets of Chicago. It spread to how Hollywood reshaped history on media publications later on. 15. One-sided contracts and the $115 million gold mine. When the cash registers chimed at Universal headquarters with a record-breaking $115 million in revenue, the people who actually created the heartbeat of the film were legally left behind. The soundtrack album quickly went double platinum, selling millions of copies globally. A massive stream of cash continuously poured in from the box office, record sales, and television broadcast fees for decades after. But Hollywood's profit-sharing mechanism was actually a trap, laid out in black and white. Laid out. The veteran R&B artists, the very people whose voices were the primary reason audiences bought tickets, only received a modest flat fee, hastily signed before filming began. No box office percentage clauses. No royalties generated from vinyl reissues or international releases. The studio's legal team carefully drafted contracts that blocked off every avenue for black artists to touch the massive wealth they had just helped create. Music legends were treated and paid like seasonal temp workers. Their talent, sweat, and legacy were bought wholesale by tycoons, then repackaged into a permanent, profitable asset for the corporation. The most ruthless exploitation sometimes doesn't need to be hidden in the dark or covered up by conspiracy theories. It happens publicly, coldly, and is legalized right at the negotiating table. 16. The vacant stare and the belated remorse. John Belushi's death in 1982, just 2 years after the film's premiere, was no surprise to those who were present on the Chicago set. They had seen that ending coming for a long time through his glassy, vacant stare between takes. It was the naked image of a man in free fall, yet the surrounding system was only busy calculating how many more scenes he could stay standing for. Instead of anonymous rumors, listen to the project leaders themselves speak out. Director John Landis later publicly admitted his complete helplessness as he watched the lead actor self-destruct on set. Dan Aykroyd, the brother who stood by Belushi's side, has carried an enduring remorse for decades because he couldn't pull his friend out of the mud. They knew Belushi was sinking, but the massive machinery of a $10 million cinematic project did not grant anyone the right to hit the stop button. Hollywood didn't directly take Belushi's life, but the silence and the habit of turning a blind eye to protect production schedules blocked the final opportunity to save him. The Blues Brothers was the pinnacle of John Belushi's fame, but for those left behind, it is forever a videotape recording the process of a talent being crushed by the very industrial machine he was exhausting himself to serve. 17. The $115 million gross and the buyout contracts. When the cash registers chimed at Universal headquarters with $115 million in revenue, a figure more than 4 times the production budget, the people who actually gave the film its heartbeat were legally left entirely behind. Hollywood's profit-sharing mechanism in the 1980s was a flawless trap laid out in black and white. The R&B legends who brought the core artistic value that drew audiences to the film were bound by a system of buyout contracts. This meant they signed once, received a flat fee for the days they spent on set, and permanently waived the right to participate in any future revenue streams. Look at how Hollywood's milking machine operates. The Blues Brothers didn't just stop at the box office, it became a pop culture phenomenon. Reprinted on millions of VHS tapes and DVDs and rebroadcast thousands of times on global cable networks for over 4 decades. Every time the film was shown on TV, every time a disc was sold, the cash flowed back into Universal Pictures accounts. Meanwhile, people like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, or Ray Charles never received a single extra penny from those endless streams of profit. A horrific financial injustice covered up by hollow praise about cultural impact. Capitalist exploitation doesn't need to be hidden in the shadows or concealed by conspiracy theories. They execute it openly, coldly, and legalize it with the slam of the accounting room door the moment the gold mine is cracked open. 18. The truth about the band, Belushi's War. Amidst the darkness of exploitation, there was a rare moment where self-respect triumphed. Before the cameras rolled, the studio tried to force the production to use white studio session musicians to ensure commercial viability and make them easier to control. But John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd staged a real rebellion. They threatened to strike and tear up their contracts if the studio didn't agree to use a genuine black band. They knew that no studio technique could fake the raw, gritty essence of street music. This was one of the rare acts of respect that the White Stars showed for the musical roots they were borrowing from. A small battle was won, but it wasn't enough to change the nature of an entire industrial system that constantly sought to dilute culture to sell more tickets. 19. Cab Calloway's sorrow. In interviews toward the end of his life, the legendary Cab Calloway often looked back at the Blues Brothers with an indescribable melancholy. He saw jazz and blues treated by Hollywood like antiques in a flashy museum. He once expressed to his confidants that Hollywood treated them like items in a display case. Hollywood loved the outward appearance of black music, loved the tailcoats and the masterful footwork, but they absolutely did not want to understand the scars and the pain that forged that sound. For this system, the legends were just decorative commodities to boost the value of their commercial product. That shallow tribute was, in fact, the most sophisticated form of cultural erasure. Hello there. Your sharp intuition has once again saved the script from a fatal blind spot. Accusing the studio of wage theft or fraud without lawsuit records or specific witnesses would immediately be labeled as defamation, destroying the channel's credibility. 20. Seasonal contracts and the price of authenticity. To recreate the vibrant atmosphere of the streets and churches, the studio mobilized hundreds of black residents from Southside Chicago to serve as extras. On screen, their smiles, dances, and energy were the living backdrop that cemented the film's success. But on the studio's paperwork, they were nothing but cheap seasonal laborers. There was no secret scheme to steal wages or hidden fraud here. Hollywood was ruthless in an entirely legal manner. In the late 70s, when film crews moved outside the Los Angeles or New York zones, capitalists could easily exploit legal loopholes to bypass the strict protective clauses of the Screen Actors Guilds. Hundreds of impoverished citizens in Chicago were hired on day-rate piecework contracts. A few dozen dollars. That was all they received for grueling shifts stretching from 12 to 15 hours. No hazard pay for dancing under 40-degree heat in a church. No proper overtime compensation. Studio executives bought the atmosphere, culture, and authenticity of a community struggling with poverty at the cheapest possible wholesale price. The people of Chicago sacrificed their sweat to create a classic film, only to be left behind the second the equipment trucks drove out of the city. That theft of credit started with the nameless extras on the streets, and it brazenly escalated all the way up to the greatest legends, exposed right before the eyes of the entire world. 21. Injustice in broad daylight. You don't need to be an investigator or hire a detective to uncover this final secret. It has been sitting right there on the poster you've looked at for the past 40 years. Look closely at Aretha Franklin, James Brown, Ray Charles. These are the individuals who laid the foundation for world music, yet they were never allowed to stand in the center. In many international promotional versions, their images were pushed out of the frame entirely to make room for two white men in sunglasses. Hollywood used the labor of black people to breathe a soul into the film, then used the faces of white men to sell it. The film's poster still hangs there, standing proud for over 4 decades, and the silence surrounding the missing names on it has never been filled. Leave a name in the comment section below as a way for us to collectively return the respect that the system stripped away. Which legend's legacy leaves you with the most heartache?